Welcome to A Journey Through NYC Religions Television. I'm Tony Carnes, your host. Today, we have a special treat. Brian Finnerty, our producer, occasionally joins us on stage, and it is always a fun experience. Today, he's going to be our host. Brian is a longtime member of Opus Dei. He is the United States Communications Director, and he is going to interview John Coverdell, the leading historian in the English-speaking world of Opus Dei. I think you're going to enjoy the program.
My name is Brian Finnerty. I'm here with John Coverdell, historian, the author of several books on histories of individual figures within Opus Dei, and the author of a new book on the institution Opus Dei itself, the history of Opus Dei. And so we're going to take this as an opportunity to take a look at the new book, but also look at some interesting points about the history of Opus Dei. So John, thank you very much for being with us.
It's a great pleasure to be here, Brian.
Yeah, so maybe what we might start is a little bit about going back to the actual moment of the founding of Opus Dei. And I think, one point related to that, which is sort of striking to me, is, for example, if you look at the document by which Opus Dei by which the Church officially recognized Opus Dei as a personal prelature, it refers to that moment in which Opus Dei saw this by divine inspiration. So tell us a little bit about what happened when the founder of Opus Dei founded Opus Dei, and what was that thing that he actually saw?
Well, I think first of all we need to go back a little bit. So some 10 years earlier, when he was a teenager, he had a sense that God was asking something special of him, but he didn't know what that was. He decided that whatever it was, it would be better accomplished if he were a priest. So he entered the seminary and was eventually ordained. And during all those years, he was praying, Lord, that I may see, Lord, let it be whatever this is that you want. And he said that he had what he called inklings, but somehow the picture didn't come together. I kind of like to think of it as the pieces of a mosaic that little by little he was discovering, but he couldn't figure out quite how to put them together. And then on the 2nd of October, 1928, he was making a retreat in Madrid. And he was always very reluctant to talk about any details of that event, that experience. He pretty much limited himself to saying, I saw Opus Dei. And he was very much convinced that that was something from God, that it wasn't just that he had finally thought up something, but rather that God had revealed to him what it was he wanted him to do. And that, I think, is a very important point, both in the history of Opus Dei, but also in the life of Opus Dei, that I think the members of Opus Dei, myself included, are convinced that that was true, that it isn't just a nice thing or a good idea some holy priest had, but is literally, as he often stressed, doing something that God specifically wanted done.
Yeah, and he was very protective of that idea that there was some charismatic impulse or some idea that had been given him by God, and that he was there to try to help to carry out to completion.
That certainly is true, yes. He was very much convinced, and I worked with him fairly closely for a number of years, and he made a very sharp distinction between those things that he thought were part of what God had revealed to him, asked him to carry out, and other aspects of the undertaking that he had worked out and that were good or not so good, whatever, but he really made that distinction quite clearly.
Can you explore a little bit more about what were the core content of this message that he
Well,
had
I think the core content and the core of Opus Dei is basically this message, which is that God calls everyone to holiness, that's not a prerogative of those who are called to, say, become a priest or a nun or live in some special form, but that everyday Christians, ordinary people with their family, their job, their golf game, all those things, are called to be holy. That when our Lord says in the gospel, be ye perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect, he wasn't talking to a small set of people. He was talking to a big crowd, and he was saying it to farmers and laborers and housewives and all sorts of people.
Mm-hmm.
And that is possible. Okay, so I think it's one thing to say that God calls everyone to holiness, to really love him with your whole heart, mind, and soul, which is what holiness is about. And another thing to believe that it, A, is possible generally, and B, applies to me. And I think that's
right.
really what Opus Dei is about.
I think, yeah, another thing too that you've said about that particular moment, October 2nd, 1928, when you founded Opus Dei, or when God, illuminated that, there was a combination of both an institution and a mission.
Well, that's right. I would say there's a mission, which is this message that we just talked about, to spread that message. And then a group of people who, A, would try to make it a reality in their own life, and B, try to spread it to others. And then finally, an institution which would provide them the help, the support that they needed in order to do that.
Right.
And that institution, at first he didn't even have a name for it. He just called it the work, but not in the sense of the translation of the Latin term Opus Dei, which means work of God, but just this undertaking, this thing we're doing. But later he realized, of course, he had to have a name, and he chose this name, Opus Dei.
And one of the key aspects of that too, what was that sense of vocation. Yeah, this is not just something that people would, just attach themselves to as something nice, but
well, that's
more
right.
than that.
So that's right. So I think we have two aspects there. The one is that the undertaking itself was something that God specifically wanted and willed, and the other that for each individual who approaches Opus Dei is the sense God is calling me to do this as the sense of my life, as why he put me here on earth. We might use the term vocation or calling or whatever term you want to use, but yes, that's a very important element.
Can you also clarify a little bit? Yeah. So some of these ideas about lay holiness, were already around before, but not quite in this. What was sort of unique or distinctive about the approach of St. Josemaria?
Well, certainly there had been people in the church, and there were at that time people who were saying that, yes, we're all called to holiness. But there are, I think, several important differences. The first one, perhaps, that most, at least, of the people who talked about that kind of thing thought of it as an adaptation for lay people of the life of, say, the members of the religious orders, like a Jesuit or a Dominican or a Franciscan or something like that. Pope John Paul I wrote an article about St. Josemaria at one point, and he said, well, one of the differences is that his predecessors had talked about a spirituality for lay people, but he presented a lay spirituality, one that grew out of their actual condition as people living in the world, raising a family, holding down a job. So that's one important difference. And another one was precisely the aspect of an institution within the church that would make this its special mission, whose wasn't there to, found schools or care for orphans or something like that, but precisely to spread this message and to help people put it into practice in their lives.
One way they like to explain it, maybe you could touch upon it, is it was like going back to the early Christians. What did he mean by that?
Well, I think he meant that the first generations of Christians had a very real sense of being called to holiness, not to just be a nice guy or whatever, but to really love God, love their neighbor. And he would point out how often, particularly St. Paul, would use the term saints to talk about the people he was writing to, who were normal people living normal lives. So they took it very seriously, but they also didn't feel any call to live their, if you like, their exterior life, their ordinary day-to-day activities in a way different than their fellow citizens. And one of the early Christian writers, one of the fathers of the church, talks about that. Said, we don't live in separate cities. We don't dress differently than you do. We don't have a special way of talking, etc. We are just like you, except that inside we're different.
Yep.
And he thought that the message of Opus Dei was precisely, in a sense, a return to that sense that the first few Christian generations had.
One piece of evidence for there being something quite innovative about it might be the fact that, in fact, it did run into some early opposition, and we might almost say that things, the moment they founded Opus Dei, it did not initially seem like an overwhelming success in those early years, and then things got a lot worse.
Well,
so could you talk about?
I think that's true. So the beginnings were very difficult and very slow. People would hear what he had to say and maybe even become enthused, but then they'd just kind of disappear. He talked about it like trying to catch eels in the water with your bare hands. Then after a while, there began to be considerable opposition, not only to the specific activities of the institution, but to the very idea that there could be a calling within the church to holiness that didn't involve leaving ordinary life. A young Jesuit priest, for instance, said and wrote, he said, it is simply impossible for a man who wears a suit and a tie to be fully holy in the same sense that a priest or a nun is.
Yeah, it's funny. It doesn't seem like type of thing that you would expect to evoke fierce opposition. I mean, so it doesn't seem a little bit surprising from our perspective today that it.
Well, at least from our current perspective, yes, because clearly, the Second Vatican Council made this message its own. How much of that it gathered from Opus Dei and how much from other sources, a question I think historians haven't really delved into very much yet. But certainly the message that he was preaching and that people at the time thought some people said was heretical, is right there, preached to the whole church by the Second Vatican Council.
Yeah, and then as we said, so things were rough going at the beginning, and then suddenly things got a whole lot worse. So what happened there?
Well, externally, particularly, this Opus Dei was founded in Madrid, in Spain, and the situation in Spain became political and social situation became at first extremely difficult, with a lot of persecution of the church, and then degenerated in 1936 into a civil war, which lasted almost 3 years, lasted until the spring of 1939. So just at that point, 35, 36, he had begun to meet with some success. There were a number of young men and a few women who had joined Opus Dei, and they had opened a student residence, and things seemed to be, if not taking off, at least getting off to a better start. And then along came this terrible civil war in which about 7,000 priests were assassinated, and a couple 100,000 Spaniards died on the two sides. And the members of Opus Dei were spread out, separated from each other and from him. So it was a very difficult period. And for those 3 years, Opus Dei was kind of on hold in a sense. But what he pointed out to the members said, now is the time to grow on the inside. In Spain, they grow a lot of winter wheat, which is sown in the fall and it's kind of just there in the earth during the winter months, and then springs up in the spring and is harvested. And so he talked about like the farmer who said, well, the plants are growing now on the inside. And he said, that's up to us now to come closer to God, to grow on the inside.
Getting back to the foundational developments for a moment. So we talked about what happened October 2nd, 1928 in Madrid. Mm-hmm. And you talked about some graces leading up to that. But there were some further sort of impulses of the Spirit, if we might call it that way, these locutions that he had, this opening up to women. Could you touch a little bit upon those?
Sure.
And what happened there?
So, it wasn't, we don't know, and I don't think we will ever know what exactly he saw and didn't see or what it was like on October 2nd. But we do know one very important fact, which was he understood that, at least as an institution, the message clearly was applicable to anyone, men and women, whatever age, etc. But he was convinced that as an institution, Opus Dei would be only for men. And then in the early 1930s, precisely while he was celebrating Mass, God told him, no, I want women in Opus Dei. So that's perhaps the most important. Another very important one was that, of course, part of the spirit that he lived and was trying to transmit to others included the sense of being a son of God, that God is our Father. I mean, that obviously is part of the Christian message. But it wasn't particularly central to his personal spiritual life or what he was trying to help other people do until, again, in the 1930s, when he had several strong senses, periods in which he just sensed, I am a son of God. God is my Father. And he understood that those experiences were not just for him personally, but that were meant to be what he was passing on to people. And so from that time on, he consistently said that the sense of being a child of God is the foundation of the spiritual life of members of Opus Dei. There were a lot of other things, but those are probably the two most important.
Sort of like an interesting, almost paradox or something in that. So he wanted to emphasize very much this thing of holiness in the ordinary, and he did have these locutions, as they're called, these specific divine impulses that he did not want to overemphasize. One of them being that moment in which he had that heightened sense of divine filiation. Could you talk about what happened? What happened in that moment in the streetcar in Madrid, and what the significance that he saw?
I think we've already said it basically, that he had gotten on a streetcar in Madrid, and he just had this overwhelming sense that God is my Father. And he got off the streetcar, and he says he wandered around the streets of Madrid using the phrase from the scripture, Abba, Pater, Daddy, Father. And he said, I did that probably for several hours, perhaps out loud. He said people probably thought I was crazy.
Yeah, well, and you and one of those impulses as well was that Opus Dei was intended for women as well. And you've written about Guadalupe Ortiz, and could you tell us a little bit more about her and her process of, well, she's been beatified now, so tell us a little bit about Guadalupe Ortiz.
Well, she was one of the very early members of the women's branch, or at least one of the very early people who joined Opus Dei, women who joined Opus Dei and persevered, because there had been several groups of women who, for one reason or another, had not persevered, had not captured what it was that he was trying to do. She was a chemist, had eventually earned a PhD in chemistry, which was very unusual in Spain at that time. Few women went to college at all, and the ones who did mostly studied either teacher's college or literature or things like that. So for a woman to be a PhD in chemistry was really quite unusual. And she was the first woman of Opus Dei, or the leader of the first group of women of Opus Dei, who went to Mexico to start Opus Dei there in 1949. And she worked there for a number of years, and then she came back and worked in the central governing body of the women's branch of Opus Dei in Rome for a number of years. And she was in quite poor health much of the time, and had heart problems. And eventually she died relatively young in Madrid, and was recently declared blessed, beatified, which is the second last step in the process of being declared a saint.
Right. And she seems like she really was, by many standards, a very extraordinary individual. One of the stories I liked was her being offered going to these quite dangerous areas in Mexico, and someone offering her a gun for protection, and she declined that. Yeah, can you maybe tell a story about that?
She said, no, I don't want to carry a pistol because I might mistakenly think that somebody was attacking me and shoot them, and that'd be terrible. But what I will do is carry a knife, because if it comes to knife range, I'll be sure that they really are attacking me. And there was at least one occasion when she got off a bus in a tiny little town and was walking along, and a man started following her down the street, and she took a turn, and he took a turn, and so on. And then finally she turned around, kind of ran up and slapped him in the face and said, "Get out of here," and he ran away.
And so anyway, so Opus Dei went through the Spanish Civil War, which was really a miracle that survived. Then the Spanish Civil War ended, and then there was this remarkable expansion. St. Josemaria had sort of seen it as being international from the beginning, but then finally it was possible for that to begin to take place. Can you describe a little bit how that unfolded?
Actually, as shortly before the beginning of the Spanish Civil War, in that summer of 1936, he was already preparing a small group of people to go to Paris, even though there were only, I don't know, maybe 12.5 members of Opus Dei in the whole world. But then, of course, that was cut short by the Civil War, and then the Second World War came along. The Spanish Civil War lasted for 3 years till spring of 1939. Summer of 1939, the Second World War begins. So Opus Dei expanded quite a bit in the early 40s, but exclusively within Spain, because there was no possibility of doing anything else. And then as soon as the Civil War ended, Opus Dei began to expand first in Europe, Italy, Portugal, and then England, Ireland, etc. And then, say, 1949, United States and Mexico. And after that, in the early 1950s, it expanded a great deal, both in South America, most of the countries of South America, and much of Western Europe, almost all the major countries of Western Europe, and two sort of outliers, Japan and Kenya. So Kenya, obviously a society very different from what any members of Opus Dei knew anything much about. And Japan, not only that, but in a country in which Catholics were a very tiny minority.
A process of establishing as a Catholic institution was the juridical approval. And could you maybe explain a little bit about why he saw that as so important and why it turned out to be quite a thorny issue?
Okay, so we're talking about getting official approvals from the church. From the very beginning, he had the backing and support of the Bishop of Madrid, but it was just an informal thing that he kept him informed about what he was doing, and the bishop said, keep it up. But he needed some sort of formal approval, which would come first from the Bishop of Madrid, and then ultimately from the Holy See, so that Opus Dei could expand throughout the world. And maybe because I'm a lawyer, but it's very clear to me that that's very important to have the approval of the church. But the thing that made it difficult was not, I think, that church officials didn't support it or didn't think it was a good thing. I don't think that was a problem so much. Sometimes that was true. But the big problem was you can't just be approved, okay, you're good people. You have to be approved as something. If we're thinking about American civil law, you want to start a business, well, you got to be a corporation or an LLC or a partnership or something like that. You can't just say, well, we just approved by the government, but generically. And the Opus Dei was so new in what it was proposing that there wasn't any category in which it fit well. So that's what made the process quite difficult. And he had, over time, to accept different legal categories that didn't really fit very well what Opus Dei actually was, but was the best that could be done at the time.
John Paul II had and played an important role in the history of Opus Dei, and both in terms of the establishment as personal prelature and the canonization. Can you sort of sketch that out?
Well, so again, John Paul II eventually approved Opus Dei as what it is today, something called a personal prelature. And I don't think we have time, and I'm not sure our audience would care to learn a lot about what that means technically. But anyway,
well, the elevator description of what it might be is personal prelature is what?
A personal prelature is a little piece of the church headed by someone who carries out functions similar to those of a bishop. He may or may not be ordained a bishop, and to which people belong not the way you belong, say, to a diocese because you live in a particular place, so location, but because of something about who you are. In our case, that you have the call to live this particular spirit. Okay, and the other very important thing that John Paul II did was first to beatify, that is to say, to give the title of blessed to St. Josemaria, and then ultimately to canonize him, say that he is among the saints.
And I think one of the things that you've especially enjoyed writing about, with respect to John Paul II, is a friendship that existed between Alvaro del Portillo and Bishop Alvaro Portillo, St. Josemaria's successor, and John Paul II. Could you touch upon that human
they
dimension?
were just very good friends, and the Pope fairly frequently invited him for dinner and, sent him presents for his birthday and that sort of thing. But the thing that I guess most impresses me was early on in their relationship and their friendship, Don Alvaro, who was the successor of St. Josemaria, learned that, and this was early in the Pope's pontificate, that it was a custom in Poland to send people oranges for the feast of St. Nicholas just before Christmas. And he thought, well, maybe nobody in Rome will remember to do that. So he sent a basket of oranges and some other things, some books, etc., to the Pope. And a couple of days later, the Pope sent him one of these Italian breakfast cakes, a panettone. Now, I just think that's kind of wonderful. You imagine a Pope sending someone a signed picture of himself or a rosary or a holy card or whatever. But a panettone, you don't imagine that.
So, all right, well, John, thank you very much. That's all we have time for today, but I appreciate you sharing with us. And thank you for listening.